Welcome to the LSE China Development Forum and our panel discussion on hammer, sickle and the skills of justice, progress and challenges in China's legal development. It's great to welcome our panelists today, and I would like to quickly introduce them. They are Zhi Yin, a research scholar at the US Asia Law Institute of the New York University School of Law. There is Haibin Xue, managing partner of the Zhonglun Law Firm, and Catherine Wilhelm. She's the executive director of the US Asia Law Institute. Welcome, everybody.
Hey.
First of all, I would like to mention to our audience that we do this as a webcast because of the coronavirus and the travel restrictions in place. Let me start with a question to all of you, and I would like to ask you to paint the picture for us, which is, where have you been seeing the biggest progress in China's legal system over the last couple of years? Haibin, if I may start with you.
Well, if this progress, then probably is changes instead of progress. There has been a lot of changes, both against the changing domestic environment and also geopolitical environment globally. So previously it was more of a military-led system, liberation style in China, and then change into like a people-led movement system. Is the great cultural revolution, and then now it's more of an economically driven and globalization, probably now leading to kind of a localization now with a political system in place. So now it's a combination of both development inside China, from a combined criminal and civil system into more elements into economic elements like competition law, IP protection, and then certainly with the globalization also those treaty-based and bilateral or multilateral agreement. So it's a comprehensive system and keep on changing, dynamic system.
Zhi Yin, where have you seen the biggest developments in China's legal system over the last couple of years?
If it is in terms of a criminal system, certainly it's more to a fair trial system in comparison with its past. And in terms of civil system, it has more modern economic elements incorporated into the system before the very simple civil code.
Let me move on to Zhi Yin, Haibin, and let me ask her where she has seen the biggest steps taken in China's legal system.
Okay, thank you. I think the biggest change is after the fourth plenum in 2014. It's the first time for a party session to center on rule of law. And this document issued after this session became a very important guidance for the judicial reforms from then on. So to move it to two specific points I want to raise. One is judicial transparency. And now the public have access, public in the world have access to over 55 million judgments issued by the Chinese courts. They can streamline court trials from home, and litigants can check their case status and judgments enforcement information online. This mega online data provide a huge advantage for the public and scholars to study and monitor the judicial system, which has considered to be very difficult to access for outsiders before 2013. The second change is the judiciary's openness to technology, the advanced technology like IT, big data, online tools. This ongoing judicial reform is now talking about online case filing system, cell phone court, online phone, no-bill courts, like this kind of IT utility for the judiciary. So it could significantly save limited judicial resource and improve efficiency.
Catherine, would you agree with her that technology is basically one of the biggest developments in China's legal system over the last couple of years and will still be in the future?
Well, technology can cut both ways, of course. I mean, technology is just a tool. So it can facilitate access to the system. It can certainly facilitate transparency. And I completely agree that transparency of the courts has been a huge move forward. And we really can watch trials online and see judgments that even a few years ago we could not. But of course, technology can be used against the principles of rule of law as well. So it's simply a neutral tool. But I would say that Haibin and Chi have pointed out some really important advances. I would also add a few additional ones, which is greater professionalization amongst the legal profession. There's been greater professionalization within the courts. There's been a vast increase in the number of lawyers and a rise in the quality of lawyers, the educational qualifications. There's been a introduction of a small but increasingly important public interest legal bar, which is to say lawyers who don't focus on commercial cases, but on using law to actually advance the rule of law itself and to establish legal principles to show the public and the government that the people recognize the role law can play in their lives and are actually actively using the law, because no legal system can develop fully and mature if the only activity is coming from the side of the government. For a legal system to really be mature and to flourish, citizens need to actively use it. And we are starting to see that happen. There's much greater public awareness of the law, awareness among ordinary people and small businessmen, farmers, and so on, that law is something they can use in their lives. And that is an essential piece of development of rule of law and maturation of the legal system. And we are seeing that happen.
On the point of legal professionals and lawyers, Haibin, you at Zhonglun Law Firm, you have some 3,000 employees in 18 offices around the world. Your law firm is one of the top 3 law firms in China. If you give some advice to young professionals entering the field, in which domain should they be looking for work?
Well, with the globalization and also commercialization, it seems always we are more concentrating on commercial related corporate matter, certainly involving civil matter. We do criminal law, but it's just a tiny base of our services from our firm's perspective. If it is from a commercial perspective, it's always the corporate commercial related sector where will attract more young people, talented people, and then if everyone is chasing money, well, right or wrong, but then it may be more of a commercial sector and corporate sector, corporate finance, cross-border M&A, cross-border dispute will be all those sectors which are fairly popular. There are a lot of space for further future development.
There have been so many reforms and opening up measures by the Chinese government over the last couple of years, but still, of course, there are many loopholes in the legal system in China. So, where do you see the biggest gaps, and what kind of challenges should the Chinese government confront when it comes to these legal reforms?
Well, legal reform. Is that?
Sorry, go ahead, Haibin.
No, go, please.
Oh, okay. I'll give you an example. And after the fourth plenum, the party promoted to reform and to improve the judicial procedure by making the trial center of litigation. So 2016, the Supreme People's Court and the Supreme People's Procuratorate, the Ministry of Public Security and Ministry of National Security and the Ministry of Justice issued opinion to reform the justice system by making trial meaningful. Then how could this be done? On one hand, they need to triage the case. In complicated cases, they should have a full-blown trial, have a witness testify in court to be subject to cross-examination. On the other hand, they should, in simple non-contested cases, and we apply a system called, it's a long name, it's called admit guilt and accept punishment in exchange for leniency. So it's a Chinese version of a guilty plea system. So far, so good, right? It's good reform to move forward. But the problem is to implement this system, we need to provide lawyers to defendants who wish to plead guilty. That's a minimum requirement for due process. Then the problem is to finding that many of lawyers. So before this reform, on average, about 30% of defendants have a counsel, and over 80% of criminal cases are minor, non-contested cases, like a drunk drive. How can we bridge the gap? So the legislative has created a duty lawyer system where duty lawyers will be stationed at detention centers or the courts or prosecutor's office, and they see the clients they could see 20, 30 clients every day. So practice varies in different locations in China. Some places, duty lawyers, they don't have access to the evidence before they're giving legal advice to their client. What happens is that when the defendant is ready to plead guilty, to sign a plea paper, the duty lawyer will be called in to witness the signature on the paper. So some places, duty lawyer cannot provide efficient, meaningful assistance to their clients. So you see, the initial reform design is good to attempt they attempt to protect defendants' right, either in small cases or complicated cases. But the outcome, the big loophole we've seen is that actually there's no effective assistance of counsel. So that's an example, and you can use this example in many other situations in the judicial reform.
Catherine, you have lived in China for more than 20 years and are now based in New York with the US Asia Law Institute. If you compare China's legal development to the one in the United States, for example, how will it be different? And what are some of the biggest challenges that you are seeing over the next couple of years?
Well, in each country, the legal system reflects both the history, the historic path that that country has followed, and also the needs that they are facing at the moment. So no country's path to development of a legal system is going to be identical. And there's no way in which we can simply do what I call plug and play, where you take a set of laws from one country and then you try to slot them into another country and say, here, this has worked well for us, you try it. What we try to do at my institute, the US Asia Law Institute, which is sits within the New York University Law School, is we try to facilitate a dialogue across borders between US and other systems, including other jurisdictions within Asia, and Chinese lawyers and others within the legal system in China, to have a conversation about what are some of the legal challenges that our societies face that are similar, and how are we respectively addressing them for, as we say, reference, for sankao, so that one system can say to the other, well, we have tried such and such, and here's how it works. So Chur-In was just discussing the system of duty lawyers, for example, where there are comparable steps taken in other jurisdictions around the world. How do you deal with low-level cases, for example, where there's no contest over the facts? You want to deal with them efficiently. You don't want to waste a lot of judicial resources, but you also want to ensure that people's rights are fully respected. You don't simply want to run straight over the rights of the defendant in the interest of dealing with the case quickly. So there's a balancing that goes on. So we in the States have introduced certain kinds of solutions to that. Those solutions have had downsides, and it can be useful for us to say to Chinese colleagues or colleagues elsewhere, this is what seems to work. This is what is not working so well. This is where we're worried about the problems that our own solutions have introduced, the unintended consequences of our solutions. You, in thinking about your own solutions, should be aware of these unintended consequences. And so you have a dialogue in which you're comparing what seems to work, what is not working, and then each jurisdiction can adopt measures for their own, that suit their own history, their own capacities, and their own the number of lawyers that they have and so on, their resources, the human resources. The overall challenge that is probably the most pressing for China is is still at the level of system change. How does the legal system fit into the larger political system? How are the rights that are established in laws going to be both implemented consistently across the board and also protected when there's a conflict with some other interest coming from somewhere else in the system? That has been a problem all along, and it remains a major problem. It's not a problem exclusive to China, but it does remain the largest problem that China needs to address as it moves forward.
It's very interesting because we, of course, have the US-China trade war on the economic and business front, but at least there seems to be an exchange or dialogue, as you call it, on the legal cooperation and exchange of expertise. So that's good news. Haibin, let me ask you, so the rule of law has been one of the core socialist values for the Communist Party. How do you see this concept of the rule of law working together with the government in the future, and where do you see some headwinds maybe as well, Haibin?
Well, it's on one hand is rule of law, and then the other aspect is like a goal or purpose-driven approach. It's a kind of a combination because the rule of law is all ultimately for the public order or social order, and social order or public order always have the root in the in that specific region. And China, with its own history and also existing surrounding environment, especially those geopolitical conflicting environments, this eventually, if I can make an analogy, globally, China, if it's domestically, China is seen as like a party-led state with one party's interest potentially conflict with the Western style rule of law, which have the priority. And then if I do another analogy, if the whole globe of the earth is compared as another system, then the system is run probably by a state-led system. It's one of the two countries or one of the superpower trying to implement all the best interests in their own interest. So in that comparison, so globally, this system is more like a state-led system with one state with all the priority, and then treating the other state with different double standards. And then in China, then it's probably arguably, if Chinese one-party-led system is, well, there's a conflict potentially always the party's interest, even though the party is representing the people, but then party is party and then people or state is state. But then it's a kind of a analogy. If there is a peaceful one standard instead of a double standard global environment, I hope China will soon be able to adopt a fully domestic, globally domestic system with a pure rule-based system. But as it stands now, it's a great challenge. On one hand, globally, you face with all those double standards, and then certainly you mentioned about the trade war. On one hand, China is viewed as the largest market for the world, so everyone is pushing, or at least some state-led system is pushing China to open the market by changing the rule of law. On the other hand, and then China looking towards the other side of the world, some states has like technology, and then there are certainly those sanctions available, and then there are those export control. So on one hand, one state is keeping every technology as the, because it's fundamentally it's in breach of the competition law if it's abuse of dominant position, abuse of those competition rule, if you restrict supply, if you refuse to supply technology on the other hand, you try to push the China to change the rule to open the market. So then with the global change, hopefully leading to a one system, and China, I hope, will be able to catch up the environments, whatever it is.
There are so many different forces at play, isn't it, Haibin? Let me ask you, you have been a judge in Sichuan province in China, but you're also licensed to practice in New York State, so you can really compare different systems. So let me ask you, when it comes to the concept of rule of law, where does China stand? Would you agree with Haibin, and what kind of changes would you like to see to China's rule of law?
This is a very good question. This rule of law, actually in Chinese, there is a 依法治国. There are even disputes about how to translate 依法治国. And some people maybe most people agree to use the rule of law, the rule of law. But also, a lot of people say it should be a rule by law or governing the country according to law. So, when we talk about rule of law, are we talking about the Aristotle idea about governing the people by better by best law rather than by best man? Or are we talking about how to governance this country efficiently and orderly? So I think in China, from what we've discussed, there's the party clearly is above the law, and everything should be under party's control, including the judiciary, the government, everything. Even the super powerful supervision committee should under the party control. So from this sense, it's more like use law as a tool to manage the country. I would say we China have rule by law, not rule of law. I'm sorry?
Is this a good thing, do you think?
I think if we look at China's legal history after 1979, it's a significant, we have significant accomplishments. So we are moving forward, but it's not the thing we should stop here. We should keep moving to the real rule of law.
Catherine, let me ask you, so China is soon to be the world economy #1. With the rise of this superpower, how will this impact and change probably the global legal framework and also international law?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and it's one that I think people are just starting to ask themselves. Even as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, I think it was assumed that China was the receptor of influence from the outside world, and only now are we starting to realize that actually, given its size, both in population, its economic size, and increasingly its influence in politically in a global arena, in regional and global governance organizations, there is the prospect of China having influence on the world's legal system, on the understandings that we have of international law. And there is starting to be as well an awareness in international law circles that international law is not actually a single thing with a common understanding, that attempts historically to create a uniform understanding and interpretation of international law are deeply challenged when the international legal system admits to its ranks countries, major actors like China, that actually are coming from a very different legal tradition and may have very different understandings of how international law plays out and its relationship to domestic law. So I think that we are only at the beginning of seeing the impact that China is going to have on the international legal framework, just as it's taken almost 20 years now for China's impact on the world economy to be seen, to play out. Subsequent to China entering the WTO, I think we are going to have a period of time in which we start to see China's impact on the international legal system play out generally, slowly, gradually, and we don't know what that will look like. China is not necessarily trying to disrupt the global legal framework, but I think, as I said, because they are coming from a different legal tradition, and they also have their own distinct interests, it's inevitable that there are going to be challenges and it will be disruptive.
Haibin, some of the biggest hot news stories over the last couple of months all have to do with China. For example, US-China trade war, the Hong Kong protests, and now most recently the coronavirus that is impacting everyone, including you, because you're a frequent traveler. You spend about 50% of your time in China, Haibin. So do you see any direct impact from these kind of news stories on the Chinese legal system? Can you hear us?
Well, yes, it's always, everything is interconnected. And you mentioned about the China-US trade war and Hong Kong and the current virus.
That's the big band ringing there in London, right?
Yeah, that's the church. So, because everything now is interconnected, if it is about China, then certainly touch upon Hong Kong, and now you touch upon the coronavirus, and then the trade war between U.S. and then the world, because the past, if it's not the current globalization, everything is interconnected. So then, really, the system, legal system, certainly form part of the whole system. And in terms of Hong Kong, is a kind of a test of whether the Western system will work in a region with Chinese civilization, with Chinese origin, with Chinese impact. Apparently, if judged by the outcome, it may not work that well. Depends on the criteria that you're going to use. So Hong Kong is adopting a more of a British system. Well, then when dealing with, if you can define that as a crisis or social disorder, it doesn't seem to be that effective. And then in relation to like U.S. and China trade war, and then certainly is U.S. is using the U.S. priority system because it's a war, is fighting with China, and then China is certainly now is using the state-led or more the party-led system to actually fight or having war with the U.S. And no one knows the result. But then if again assessed by the outcome, then China at least, even though arguably it doesn't have a Western compatible legal system, but then somehow it has served the purpose for the Chinese to become the second number two in global economy. And then it has actually achieved a lot of things. I'm not saying every system is perfect, but then it works for China. At least if China adopted the British system like Hong Kong, it may work, may not work, but then at least it shows it works. And in terms of the coronavirus, well, it has certainly a lot of undesirable outcome now. Certainly it's still in the process, and then there are a lot of draconian measures being taken, and then certainly there are like those one hospital built in 2 days, but whether that will work or not is a question to be answered later. But then there are effective elements, and then certainly with the spread outbreak, there are certainly loopholes to be watched, to be rectified, and we'll see what the outcome will be.
Legal reforms always take a long time to be drafted and then implemented, of course, as well. Jill, let me ask you, so do you foresee more clashes or fragmentation when it comes to the global legal system in the future? Do you think that there will be more standardization between the different countries' legal systems?
I think each legal system is rooted on their culture and history. So it's hard or it's impossible for one country to completely just transplant a legal system from another country. It has to be localized. In China, I agree with Haibin what said, what works in China doesn't mean it works in other countries, and vice versa. So in China, though, now it's not perfect. We have rule by law, not rule of law, but it works in China, and always see there's room for improvement, a large room for improvement. So I think in terms of clashes, maybe it's more in the international world. And China has clearly stated in their fourth plenum, the major decision issued after the fourth plenum, they want to make their voice, have a discourse right in the international world. They want to have the Chinese voice to be heard in the international world. So I think not only inevitably Chinese legal system will impact the international world, but also Chinese intend to make a dent in the international world. So now they are organizing more international exchanges, like international forum in China, and they are working on the Belt and Road Initiative. Is a big intention to make changes in the Asia, East Asia, and more and further. So like this economy change or economy investment will inevitably change the culture, environment, and community in the Belt Road countries.
Catherine, you have a long experience, of course, as a law professional and lawyer, and you've worked a lot with civil society and on the legal reforms as well in China, but also specifically on women's rights. And I would like to ask you about that, because Decades ago, Mao Zedong said women hold up half the sky, or maybe more than that. So there is an evident bamboo or glass ceiling still also in China. But myself personally, having worked in China for 5 years, I feel that the Chinese women are more empowered or stronger or have a higher economic position or equal salary than women, for example, here in Europe, where I am based. How do you see women's rights and the need for reforms there, Catherine, in China?
Well, that's a very big question. The status of Chinese women has both cultural and legal elements. And traditionally, obviously, the Confucian tradition, women were not on an equal footing with men, and women were always expected to be responsive to and to some extent under the direction of some man in the family. That all changed very dramatically with the revolution, the Communist Revolution, and the Communist Party itself in its early years had some very emphatic statements about the equal status of women. And so over the course of the Maoist era, you had a dramatic undermining or basically tossing out the window of the Confucian tradition, and women were pushed out into society to work. Of course, a poor farm family, women always really worked, but now they were given a more formal status as workers. They had work points, and you had women in factories and women in government offices. So that created almost overnight a revolution in women leaving the home, no longer being considered under the guidance of a father or a son or some other senior male figure in the family. That created, by the time that I came to China in the 1980s, it had created a completely different culture around the status of women. But that status was not really protected by law. It was a political status, it was a social and cultural shift, but it wasn't protected by law, and we could question how deeply people in their hearts had actually changed their understandings and expectations for women. So even then, during the Maoist era, there certainly existed power imbalances and power abuses, and we didn't hear anything publicly discussed about the kinds of problems that we now are talking about with the Me Too movement. But certainly, if you look back at the scar literature of the late Maoist era, you can see women telling stories of how, especially, for example, sent down women, sent down girls from the cities going to the countryside, and then facing sexual harassment and even assault by local male officials who considered themselves to have the right to do whatever they wanted with respect to women. So what I'm saying is there was a political shift and a social shift in women's role, but how much did it really take root, and it certainly was not protected in law. Now we have seen laws in the last 2 decades, we've seen laws that try to translate this changed view of women into legal statutes. But again, the question remains, how well do people actually buy into those? How widely are they accepted? At the same time, with the rise of commercial forces, women are portrayed in advertising, in movies, in television as sexual objects. And that cuts across, that actually is in tension with the efforts to establish true equality, both in law and in society. So the position of women remains deeply contested. There have been advances, but if you talk to women about their status in the workplace, for example, they will tell you that they're not equal, that when they interview for jobs, they're asked, have you already had a child? Or now that 2 children are being permitted, have you had the 2 children that you're allowed in law to have? Or they're being asked to sign a promise that while you work with us for a certain period of time, you will not have a child, regardless of how many you may have had already. So even though as a citizen, you certainly have the right to marry and to have children, you're being asked by a prospective employer to sign away that right. So these are all very much questions. And I'm not going to try to predict what direction we go in, but China does have a very vibrant women's rights movement. And there are public interest lawyers who are trying to educate the public and also educate government officials about what equality really means and what legal protections for equality would look like.
You know what you say about the women's status and the kind of sexual profiling and so on. I find it very, very interesting. For example, I use sometimes Me Too as well. I don't know if you can see it, the Chinese app, right? Which beautifies your face and makes you look slimmer and bigger eyes and all that. And this really shows a little bit that it's one step forward and two steps back, that women are seen as Barbies or puppets or just pretty girls. I was wondering, you as a judge, right? You've had an amazing career, obviously. How difficult or easy was it for you to climb this career ladder in China in the legal, workspace?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. When I was in the court, actually, at that time, the more than 50% of employees are women, less men. And nowadays, as you know, more and more judges and prosecutors are resigning from their position to join lawyers group or to join the professorship. So even more women in the court system, or like 体制内 inside the system, than men, because inside of the system is considered like a stable, easy job, whereas outside system is more challenging, even though the income might be more rewarding. So for me in the courthouse, in the court at that time, so you see a lot of women leadership in the courthouse. Like the division head and the deputy head of the court, that they are both women. So in some sense, they have more understanding to women's dilemma, or one hand have to taking care of family, and the other hand have to moving forward in your career. So they have more understanding to women. But at the same time, I also see, like in the yuanzhang, the head of the court is still men. Like usually the deputy position are women, but the real I'm sorry.
It's still led by a male boss, like the head of the court is still a man.
Yes. Yeah.
Haibin, I would like to move to a different topic, which is that you have a lot of experience in cross-border transactions and M&A between Chinese and foreign firms. So on the 1st of January this year, 2020, China has implemented the new foreign investment law. How do you see that play out? Do you think that there will really be a level playing field for foreign companies in China?
Well, again, as a system, legal is just part of the framework. And then certainly the latest foreign investment law is going towards the direction of the concept of national treatment. Because there has been a lot of restriction in the past, and it's gradually China became more and more confident to open its own market. And then with its own technologies, probably in 5G, led by Huawei. So then with the confidence and the strength it built up in the last 30 or 40 years, and then it seems now it serves as a clear indication China is somehow opening up the market, and equally certainly will hope the world equally will open their technology market without export control, without the sanctions. And then in that aspect, China it seems that China is adopting a more proactive approach to say now we are somehow open, and then you will receive national treatment if you invest in China. And it's previously it was like category with permission, encouraged sectors. Now it's just a negative list. So unless it is fall within the negative list, otherwise you will be treated just as a domestic company. At least that's the direction, and this is just in the early stage. But then it will be has been seen with the latest transaction we acted for, and then has been much easier, quicker, and in some aspect, the bureaucracy and the governmental involvement has been substantially reduced. So I will hope in the foreseeable future, with a gradual confidence supported by technology and also probably systems, when the Chinese somehow view the Western system naturally grow up a kind of a confidence, because the system doesn't work seemingly that well. So then with those acting as a supporting strength, I hope that eventually China will open the market, and the China the foreign investment law will serve its ultimate purpose, and also as titled. Eventually, I hope it will just investment law, eliminating the foreign even. It's just investment law applying to both Chinese and foreign companies.
Talking about new laws, Catherine, China also implemented a new foreign NGO law in 2017 on January the 1st to better regulate foreign NGOs because they criticize them as Wild West style, NGOs, and basically want to better control them as well. How do you see the implementation of the foreign NGO law, and which are maybe some of the flaws?
Well, there had never been any law that directly governed foreign nonprofit organizations. And so for years, the result of that was that foreign nonprofits had to figure out some other path if they wanted to establish themselves as having legal personhood, to be a legal entity. So if you wanted to operate completely within the law and ensure that your employees, for example, your Chinese employees, were able to participate in all of the advantages of the employment system, the welfare system, and receive benefits from you as an employer, then you would register as a company. So even though you were nonprofit, you would register as a for-profit. And so many foreign nonprofits did that. Others didn't have any registered status at all, but simply located themselves inside some other legal organization. So they might have their staff sitting within a government agency, for example. So they weren't secret. They weren't, being sort of hidden. They might be in a government agency. They might be inside of a university or a school in order to create some kind of legal cover because they wanted to have legal status. So it shouldn't be understood that the nonprofits wanted to be illegal. They simply didn't have a path to legality. So from that perspective, having a law that gives them a path to legality is a great step forward, and it's something that people have been waiting for a long time. The difficulty, of course, is how do you regulate? Regulation is fine. How do you regulate? And the law that was passed came out of an impulse to protect against security threats. There was a long-running conversation within the Chinese government, amongst different ministries, as to whether foreign nonprofits, were ultimately good for the economy and good for society, contributing knowledge and contributing resources, especially to poor regions, and that was a view that was embraced by the Ministry of Civil Affairs, or on the other side, whether these nonprofits were actually some kind of a security threat and engaging in behavior that the government didn't want, whether they were encouraging Chinese civil society to be bold and to take initiatives outside of the leadership of the party. And those tensions ultimately resulted in this law. This law is a very strong security perspective, and it puts the foreign nonprofits under the management of the police. So right away, the nonprofits feel as if they're being presumed to be a threat to legality and a threat to the security of China. And it sends a signal to the Chinese people that we need the police to regulate foreign nonprofits. So that has made a lot of people very uncomfortable. The police certainly don't have any competency or knowledge of nonprofit organizations and how they work. And so that's created the need for a steep learning curve for the police to figure out what are these nonprofits anyway. And the police themselves will acknowledge, if you ask them, that they have had to learn very quickly, that they previously had a very simplistic understanding. The thing with nonprofits is we tend to assume that a nonprofit is something like the Red Cross or maybe Save the Children. These are very famous names. These are almost brands, and we understand what they are. But nonprofits actually, as defined in the law, are an extremely wide category. And it includes, for example, my own university, New York University. We are non-government, we are nonprofit, and we're outside of China. So those are the three definitions. Those are the three prongs of the definition in the law. So we at NYU would be considered a nonprofit, a foreign NGO under China's law. So obviously NYU is very different from Save the Children. Think tanks. Most US museums and art troupes, dance troupes, are all foreign nonprofits under the law. So if you're including in one category museums and hospitals and research institutes and universities and also charities, and also even nonprofits on the commercial sector. So for example, entities that promote trade promotion groups. In the United States, these are mostly registered as nonprofits. They are also part of this group. Now, if you consider all of that, you start to realize how very different they are. Different structures, different needs, different purposes for going to China. Some of them go to China because they are trying to promote the interests of an outside group of members. For example, if you're the U.S. Grains Council, you're trying to promote the interests of grains traders in the United States. If you're NYU, what you're trying to promote is education and learning. Other nonprofits are coming in. If you're Save the Children, you're trying to promote the interests of children inside China. So the objectives of these organizations are very diverse, and this has created a huge regulatory challenge. And then one last thing I'll just mention is that the reporting and disclosure requirements of the law, in fact, are incredibly onerous. And so many organizations are finding that they have steeply increased internal costs. They need extra staff. They need to hire more auditors. They have extra processes. And this is costing them time and money. And if you're a nonprofit, you don't have a lot of either of those. So there are many nonprofits, we don't know how many, that have left simply because they can't afford the cost of being regulated under this law. And I think that is one of the really most difficult aspects. You have to find a balance when you regulate between trying to preserve the sector, its viability, and the good things that come from it, the contributions that foreign nonprofits bring to knowledge and social knowledge, and in many areas, technical knowledge, for example, in the medical field or in the legal field. And on the other hand, the desire of the government to know what these organizations are doing and to make them accountable. There needs to be found a balance. And I think at this point, we're still fumbling for that balance.
Thank you, Catherine. Before we go, one final question to all of you, which is that in March we have the Lianghui, the 2 sessions are coming up, which is basically the most important annual political gathering in China. So if each of you just had one vote or one wish, what kind of legal reform would you like to see? Let me start with Haibin.
For me, it's just a legal system to form part of the larger social society. So I would really hope the legal reform will fit into the needs of the society and to make more people happy, and then to make the society more efficient and more competitive globally.
Thank you. Che?
First of all, I hope the Lianghui will be held as we have planned, and which means the coronavirus will be under control quickly and smoothly. And if we have this Lianghui and in March, and I hope to see more safeguards on defendants' rights in the current plea for leniency system, and better rules in securing career prospects of judges and prosecutors, and better measures to make trials meaningful.
Thank you. And you, Catherine?
I think I'd like to see more transparency, particularly the transparency around budget planning and budget approval. The National People's Congress is the body that approves the budget every year, and very little information about that even is given to the delegates at the National People's Congress in advance, and much less even to the public. So that would be a major step forward. And we would also like to see more transparency around the operations of the new body that was created by constitutional revision a few years ago, the National Supervision Commission. It should be reporting to the National People's Congress about its work and how it's carrying out its work.
Thank you all very much, Haibin, Che, and Catherine, for your time today and sharing your insight into China's legal development. Thank you very much.
Thank you.